Okay, well,
Yes.
welcome everyone to another edition of TEPHI Talks. TEPHI is the Texas Epidemic Public Health Institute, and my colleague here, Dr. Janelle Rios here, will explain what that is here in a second. But I'd like to welcome you to another edition of this. It's been a series of talks we've carried on for a number of years to speak about some of the interfaces between business and this, not only the pandemic that we dealt with previously, and are bringing in for a landing, but also issues that may be going forward. So at this point, my name is Bob Emery, by the way. I'm at the University of Texas School of Public Health. I'll serve as the host for this session, and we have a very exciting topic today. But before we get to the introduction of our speaker, I'll kick it over to Dr. Janelle Rios, who's the Deputy Director of TEPHI, and she can explain what TEPHI is and kind of set the stage for what it is we're getting ready to do. So, Dr. Rios.
Thank you, Dr. Emery, and thank you, Clint, for joining us. The Texas Epidemic Public Health Institute was started by the 87th Texas Legislature, and we're committed to keeping Texans safe and the economy strong by strengthening the capacity and the resiliency of Texas communities to respond to future infectious disease outbreaks. I'll draw your attention here to a photo. This was taken 2 weeks ago at the Texas Public Health Summit that was held in Houston. And these are all the volunteers who made that particular event successful. Collaborations are key. We are establishing and cultivating partnerships with governmental agencies, such as the one with Clint's agency, the Texas Department of State Health Services, Texas Department of Emergency Management, and many others, as well as professional associations, business entities, other academic institutions. One that's on the forefront is Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and other community organizations. There are many different ways to connect with us. Here's just a handful of ways. Feel free to take a photo of this, but I'll also bring it up at the very end of the webcast. Now, a few webinar housekeeping activities here. So if you're interested in a live transcript, click the CC button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. If you're interested in asking a question, click the Q&A box near the bottom of your screen and type in your question there. We have an online moderator who's going to assemble the questions and pose them back to Clint at the end of the webcast. Let's see. You'll notice that as you joined the webcast, you're muted and your camera is off, and that's by design. And you will not be able to turn those things on. Now, we are recording this session. In about a week, you're going to receive an email, and it's going to have a link to the actual recording, and that's going to be on our TEPHI YouTube page. So with that, I am going to send it back to Bob so he can introduce our speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Janelle. So it's my pleasure to introduce Clint Ladd. Clint and I have known each other for a long time, and reading the bio, you're making me feel old. But Clint is the Critical Infrastructure Protection Coordinator with the Texas Department of Public Safety, specifically with the Office of Homeland Security. His entire bio is available on the TEPHI webpage, but I just want to summarize a few points here. He has over 20 years experience in emergency preparedness, and he began his professional career as the city of Houston's first bioterrorism epidemiologist. And that's where I think I first met him 20 years ago, because I was the dirty bomb guy at that time. So just it's weird. From there, he went on to do emergency preparedness with Whit O'Brien's for over 11 years and got to travel around the country there. And then he's managed the Texas Office of Critical Infrastructure Protection, which is a component of the Texas Office of Homeland Security and the Texas Department of Public Safety. He has some very interesting accolades with regard to these fusion centers. And by the way, I've scribbled some questions for you at the end about that exact topic. But perhaps most importantly, his academic preparation is he has an undergraduate from the University of Texas, Austin in microbiology. But more importantly, as a graduate of our School of Public Health, he has a master's from the University of Texas School of Public Health. So, Clint, thanks for taking the time. Yeah, there you go. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us. And I think it'll be very interesting. And I will say, this issue of what is the critical infrastructure and who's part of it has come up repeatedly in some of these previous TEPHI talks. So that this is why we're covering this exact topic. So I'll turn it over to Clint. Thanks again.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let me throw my screen up there.
That's perfect, Clint.
Okay, can you see it? Excellent, excellent. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining me today. I'll start off by just introducing, I guess, myself a little further, or more appropriately, my agency and who I represent. So I run the Texas Office of Critical Infrastructure Protection. And this is really the lead state level entity for critical infrastructure protection in the state of Texas. It's housed within the Texas Department of Public Safety. And my position is kind of interesting in that it's paid for by the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Division, but operationally reports to the Texas Office of Homeland Security, which fulfills Director McCraw's role as the Texas Homeland Security Advisor for the state of Texas. So I have somewhat one foot in Homeland Security and preparedness and one foot in law enforcement intelligence. And that makes for a very beneficial relationship. And I'll show you a little more of that in just a second. But our primary role then is to coordinate with partners in each of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and that includes both public and private sector partners. Now, our focus areas, we generally focus on 5 mission areas, and there are the Office of Critical Infrastructure Protection, a small but dedicated group. We'd like to think that we hit above our belt, provide services beyond kind of what 2 people would normally be able to provide. But yeah, it's a small group, only 2 of us. And we provide stakeholder outreach and information sharing. So a lot of our role is just developing those relationships with critical infrastructure partners and sharing information with them. A lot of that information is related to that law enforcement intelligence that we're able to gather here within the Texas Department of Public Safety and the Texas Fusion Center. Then also, we are always gathering infrastructure data, analyzing that data, managing that information so that we have some awareness of what our critical infrastructure is throughout the state of Texas. We maintain situational awareness of threats to critical infrastructure, and we're always available to provide support to our critical infrastructure partners if they have some type of disaster incident, or even from a state level, if there's a large state level disaster response. With activation of the State Operations Center, we remain available to be activated by the Texas Division of Emergency Management to support their efforts in managing disasters at the State Operations Center, the SOC. And then finally, kind of a bucket catch-all is we can support various critical infrastructure protection efforts. And those could be anything from projects to assess the vulnerability of infrastructure. It could include supporting, for instance, the Office of the Governor in grant funding initiatives. So a lot of the grants have some verbiage in there about critical infrastructure. And so we provide various data or expertise related to critical infrastructure to support their efforts. And any number of other activities that our partners, governmental partners at the local, regional, state, or even federal level have related to critical infrastructure, we try to help to support those activities. Now, there's only 2 of us, and critical infrastructure is a pretty large role. There's a lot of infrastructure in the state of Texas, so I want to make sure that I recognize a lot of our partners, and I'm sure I've missed partners on this page, but I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that critical infrastructure protection takes a village. It's a large effort, and just within the state of Texas, there are a number of state agencies that have a role in critical infrastructure protection. In particular, there are a number of agencies that have roles or responsibilities related to one particular sector or industry, and oftentimes they are working with that specific sector on issues related to critical infrastructure protection. So a lot of what we try to do is coordinate with these partners. We coordinate with our partners on the governmental side. We coordinate with our partners on the private sector side, and we actually coordinate and host 2 state level advisory groups, one for governmental entities and one for private industry representatives as well. So that's a large function of what we do, is just this whole piece of making sure that everybody's working together, communicating. which leads me into the actual kind of topic of today's presentation. It's a topic I've been interested in and have kind of touched on in several of my presentations in the past at various conferences and such. But today we're going to really kind of do a deep dive into kind of this definition of critical infrastructure, because it really kind of lies at the crux of what I do. So I started this role about 5 years ago, actually coming up on 6 years ago now. And as you can imagine, becoming the coordinator, the critical infrastructure protection coordinator for Texas, that's kind of a fundamental question: is what is critical infrastructure? I have people come to me all the time and asks, Clint, so what is the definition of critical infrastructure? Or more appropriately, how much critical infrastructure, or what is the critical infrastructure in the state of Texas? And so we're going to dive into that. And this may be a bit pedantic. I don't know. Hopefully it's not going to be too deep. I'm going to kind of geek out with you guys and look at this issue and kind of dive into kind of the origins and history of the term critical infrastructure in the United States. So first, we're going to look at how is critical infrastructure defined. And then we're going to look at ways in which how we kind of differentiate critical infrastructure from just infrastructure. And then we're going to look at some examples of how kind of the term of critical infrastructure, how is that being applied in government practice. And this kind of goes back, and I wanted to share this pic. So I think Dr. Emery Bob mentioned kind of how this came about, but someone referred him to me, and I got an email just kind of out of the blue, and I hadn't talked to Dr. Emery in probably over a decade or longer. And I get this email that says, okay, hey, we've started this new institute, TEPHI. We're looking at pandemics. We're trying to help plan for future pandemics. And this issue of critical infrastructure popped up, and someone told me I needed to talk to you, Clint. So we got to talking about critical infrastructure and what is the definition of critical infrastructure and who is considered critical infrastructure. And he's like, hey, we have this thing called TEPHI Talks. Would you be willing to participate? So I'm like, yeah, sure, let's do it. So that's kind of why I'm here is exploring this whole piece as it relates to kind of the pandemic and in particular, examples of how this came into play during the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to get to that eventually in the presentation, but we're going to start off at kind of this broad question of what is critical infrastructure. So like I said, I've kind of talked about this in other conferences. And oftentimes how I go about addressing this topic is I'll provide a quiz to the audience. And here's my quiz. So I'll read through each of these examples, what is the best definition of critical infrastructure? And then I get the audience to vote, which one do they think is the best definition for critical infrastructure? And I will say that if you guys want to read along as you go, I'm not going to read through these definitions just yet. But I will say that C is a popular choice because it's the longest choice, I think, and has the most technical terminology or whatnot. D is also pretty popular because everyone's heard of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And then I go through and talk about where they're from. So the first is the Wikipedia definition. The second, which usually gets a couple of people interested, is actually the definition that's in the Texas Government Code. The third definition is the federal definition provided in the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001. Of course, you have PPD 21 with the 16 critical infrastructure sectors and so forth. So what we're going to do now, and I usually kind of stop, I might talk a little bit more about this, but what we're going to do now is dive in deeper into kind of this history and look at these different documents and several other documents as well. So, but actually, I do have this one slide I want to kind of, I want to address before we start looking specifically at some of those policies. And that is kind of this idea of what is infrastructure versus critical infrastructure. And if you deconstruct the terms, what the difference is, one has critical in the term and one does not. So, okay, what does critical mean? What do we mean by critical? Well, DHS has a definition of criticality. And this is pretty key to kind of what I do and how I perceive this. And I'll kind of talk about this as we go along, but how we define criticality, or at least how the Department of Homeland Security defines criticality, is the degree of dependency of a community on critical infrastructure. So how dependent is a community on a piece of infrastructure? And oftentimes that dependency, how you look at that is in terms of what happens if that piece of infrastructure is disrupted. What are the consequences of that? And how dire are those consequences? So that's often how we kind of perceive or think of this idea of criticality within the term of critical infrastructure. And there's different ways in which you can measure this, and I'll talk about those a little later. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. And we look at not only individual assets or facilities, but we'll also examine clusters and systems. A cluster being a bunch of facilities that are similar to one another, a system being more like a supply chain and each having kind of a dependency on one another. And in the rating system, there's different ways to rate this, but generally what you're looking at is you'll define it. You may give it a number rating. Oftentimes the federal government will look at level 1 infrastructure, level 2 infrastructure, on down to level 5 infrastructure, with level 1 being infrastructure of national significance, and level 5 being infrastructure of local significance. So oftentimes, again, they kind of define this within the terms of what community is really impacted by the disruption of this infrastructure. So this is kind of a key concept that we'll revisit. But let's now look at, and I forgot about this, but we have a quote here that was from a congressional report stating that for infrastructure to be judged critical, it must be vital to one or more broad national functions. National is one of those kind of criticality measures as something of national significance. And this is kind of a reoccurring theme that we see at the federal level and how they define critical infrastructure. So let's look at some of those federal definitions. And it's interesting because really that term of critical infrastructure didn't really come about within federal policy until 1996. Before that, there was discussion and legislation dealing with infrastructure. And a lot of that focused on aging infrastructure. What do we do about it? It focused on protecting infrastructure from nuclear attacks during the Cold War era and such. And so that was somewhat the focus area from the funding standpoint in the federal government. And there was never really a agreed upon definition of what is infrastructure or what is included within that term infrastructure. Well, in 1996, we have Executive Order 13010, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Executive Order in the Clinton administration. And it provided the first definition of critical infrastructure, stating that certain national infrastructures are so vital that their incapacity or destruction would have a debilitating impact on the defense or economic security of the United States. A couple of things to take note of is that term national infrastructures. Again, this idea of critical infrastructure is important to the nation. Other things of interest is that it's interested in infrastructure related to defense, so generally the defense of the nation, military, and economic security. So what do we rely upon from an economic standpoint in the United States? At that time, they did talk about 8 different critical infrastructure sectors. Well, continuing on in 1997, so part of that executive order, basically President Clinton wanted to create a commission on critical infrastructure protection. And so that commission was created and they generated their own report. And they said our basically critical infrastructure is our national defense, economic prosperity, and quality of life have long depended on the essential services that underpin our society. These critical infrastructures, energy, banking, and finance, transportation, vital human services, and telecommunications. So they identified essentially 5 sectors. Talked about national defense again, economic prosperity again, but added quality of life. So we're already starting to get kind of an increase in scope. Then going ahead in 1998, we have the Clinton administration's policy on critical infrastructure protection, Presidential Decision Directive 63, that says critical infrastructure are those physical and cyber-based systems. So now we're talking about not only physical security, but cybersecurity, essential to the minimum operations of the economy and the government. So this definition was interesting in that it kind of goes away from this idea of defense, but starts looking again, the economy, but also continuity of government. And this one then expanded on kind of prior sectors and identified 15 different sectors, which is becoming close to kind of our current model of 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Now we're going to jump ahead to 2001. And 2001 was a pretty landmark year for us. So in the realm of Homeland Security, we have the September 11th terrorism attacks. And I would say that those were a huge game changer. And based on that in 2001, you have the USA Patriot Act of 2001. And in the Patriot Act, there's a definition of critical infrastructure, a new definition. And this definition is systems and assets, whether physical or virtual, so vital to the United States that the incapacity or destruction of such systems and assets would have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination of those matters. So again, an emphasis on something that's important to the United States and to the nation. So that criticality level of having something of national significance. But it again expands. We're looking at security, we're looking at economic security, and we expand and look at public health and safety as well. And this is a pretty important definition. So to this day, this definition is still cited very commonly. And what we find is this definition, there's a lot of documents that we've seen in the future that kind of riff off of this definition and change it or streamline it to some extent. But this is still very commonly cited. And I will say that this is a definition that I often refer to as far as when it comes up to critical infrastructure. But there are reasons for that, and there's a context to that. And so we're going to dive into that a little further. But let's look at some other examples. So the physical protection of critical infrastructure and key assets, 2003. First objective of this strategy is to identify and assure the protection of those asset systems functions that we deem most critical in terms of national level public health, safety, governance, economic and national security, and public confidence. We must develop a comprehensive, prioritized assessment of facilities, systems, and functions of national level criticality and monitor their preparedness across infrastructure sectors. They have 11 sectors identified this and 5 key assets. So again, we're looking at these key terms of national level criticality, and this actually expanded and provided different functions. It included any infrastructure related to public confidence, for instance. Continuing on, we have a report in 2003 that was developed for Congress that actually asked the question, critical infrastructure, what makes an infrastructure critical? It actually looked at this. And their conclusions were basically, well, there's a ton of definitions, and none of them are really definitive or considered rigorous. But it came out with kind of this idea of essentially the problem facing the federal government is to minimize with a limited amount of resources the expected impact on the nation's critical infrastructure of any future terrorist attacks. So the key of this is we need to figure out some way to prioritize our infrastructure. There's a lot of definitions. Over time, the scope of what's considered critical infrastructure has been growing. But the key of this is that we need to be able to prioritize our infrastructure because we have a minimum or limited amount of resources available to us to protect that infrastructure. Now in 2013, we're jumping ahead quite a few years, and I'm just providing kind of a sample of how this term has been used in different documents. But in 2013, we have the PPD 21, Presidential Policy Directive 21, that identified the 16 critical infrastructure sectors that we still kind of reference and use today. Now, actually, there have been several other policies that had identified other amounts of critical infrastructure. Just prior to this one, we had 18 critical infrastructure sectors, but a couple of those sectors were kind of absorbed into the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. So this is, I bring this out because a lot of people look at critical infrastructure and they're like, okay, if something can be categorized within one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, it must be critical infrastructure, right? Well, there's actually a document out there, and this is in the process of being updated, because actually this document was never updated after 2011, and so it reflects the 18 critical infrastructure sectors, but it's 2,000 rows of identifying every single type of facility or asset that would be categorized within these critical infrastructure sectors. but it doesn't really talk about importance. I mean, it gets down to, you know, fast food joints are categorized. Pretty much any business you come up with can be categorized under one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. But not all infrastructure is critical infrastructure, right? So this allows for categorization, but it doesn't allow for any type of assessment of criticality. And so that's kind of the pitfall in looking at these 16 critical infrastructure sectors, is that anything can fit into them. And we need some way to prioritize our infrastructure and determine what is most critical. All right, let's jump ahead. 2017, a lot of you are probably familiar with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and their cybersecurity standards that they have, their framework, cybersecurity framework. Well, they provided a document, and honestly, they have a number of different frameworks or documents that they've published over the years. And most of them actually refer to that US Patriot Act definition that I provided earlier. One of them, though, has its own definition: essential services and related assets that underpin American society and serve as the backbone of the nation's economy, security, and health. Okay, so we have another definition. Here's another federal document that's created its own definition. And then also in 2019, we have Department of Homeland Security. So in 2018, you have the creation of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, within DHS. Now, DHS, along the way, was always kind of provided the role and responsibility of critical infrastructure protection for the federal government, for the nation. And then this agency, CISA, was developed within DHS to kind of concentrate on this issue of cyber and physical security of infrastructure. Well, they came up with 55 national critical functions. And if you look at the kind of the definition, it's small down there, but if you look at the definition, they basically riffed off of the US Patriot Act definition. But instead of saying, you know, critical infrastructure, you know, these systems and assets and networks or whatnot, they talk about the functions. So now suddenly CISA is not only interested in critical infrastructure sectors, but they're also interested in specific functions, which kind of complicates this whole discussion and dialogue around what is critical infrastructure. So now we have to figure out what the functions are, and the 55 critical functions. Again, though, it's talking about functions and doesn't talk about how critical a particular entity is that may provide that function. A couple of examples, we're getting into more modern times. 2019, the Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience Guide issued by CISA provides guidance. Has its own definition, again, kind of a riff off of the US Patriot Act definition, but it removes some of the terms. It still has national security, but removes another reference to the nation and also the United States. But then it has this, if you continue reading this document, it says, we know critical infrastructure as the power used in homes, the water we drink, the transportation that moves us, the stores where we shop, and the internet and communications we rely on to maintain our contact with friends, family, and colleagues. So it puts a very personal stamp on this idea of critical infrastructure. So is critical infrastructure only infrastructure of national significance? Or is critical infrastructure, does that include stuff that impacts me on a very personal level? And so, you know, there's some ambiguity here. Let's look at the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, which is basically the nation's strategy for infrastructure protection. Well, the original, I guess the current Infrastructure Protection Plan uses the US Patriot Act definition, but there's a new draft that's out there. And I had a chance to review the new draft. And you can see the definition here. Again, it kind of riffs off the US Patriot Act definition, but it removed those terms. You know, there used to be national security and national economic security. It removes some of those. It just says physical or economic security. It still says something about this infrastructure needs to be vital to the United States. But again, you have kind of this shift and evolution of these definitions. Then in 2023, we have the Infrastructure Resilience Planning Framework. We see the US Patriot Act definition again, it pops up verbatim. But then it says communities could consider all other critical infrastructure sectors deemed important and or vital to the continued performance of key social and economic functions integral to the community or regional prosperity. Well, are we talking about then infrastructure of community or regional significance? Is that what it takes to be considered critical infrastructure? Or are we talking about the US Patriot Act, where it has to be of national significance? And then if you look at CISA's website, and I just grabbed this screen grab, I look at their website just here recently, and they have a definition of critical infrastructure are those assets, systems, and networks that provide functions necessary for our way of life. Very simple, very short. And yet, if you look at their page that talks about the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, you again see that definition from the US Patriot Act. So we're seeing a number of different definitions and changes to various definitions in policy in different documents talking about critical infrastructure protection. And this was kind of an interesting outlier. So this was not talking about critical infrastructure, but it was just talking about infrastructure in general. This was a report from 2021 from the US Senate Republican Party Committee that was looking at how kind of trends in federal investment and how the term infrastructure was used. And they basically concluded that infrastructure basically only referred to a very limited number of sectors. They basically said it only referred to transportation or water resources. And over time, it looks like it's maybe expanded to include broadband and water utilities and related type assets and facilities. So it's interesting that, you know, not even the term infrastructure, because this is only a few of those sectors, those critical infrastructure sectors, where they're saying this is all that counts as far as infrastructure goes. So I just found that interesting as kind of an outlier, that there's not really an agreement at the federal level as far as what is one definition. And from my standpoint, I look at it as I would like one definition, because that's how I'm going to measure or determine or assess what is critical infrastructure. Well, let's look at Texas. I see I don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'm going to have to go through this pretty quickly. So Texas has its own definitions of critical infrastructure. We have the Texas Government Code. The definition that you see most often is in the section on Homeland Security. It says critical infrastructure includes all public or private assets, systems, and functions vital to the security, governance, public health and safety, economy, or morale of the state or the nation. So Texas has a definition that's similar to the US Patriot Act definition, but it talks about anything that's of state level significance or national level significance is considered critical infrastructure. But then there's other references of critical infrastructure in other areas. There's this in the emergency management section of the Texas Government Code. It says it differentiates utility facilities from critical infrastructure, and says critical infrastructure includes hospitals and fire stations. And then there was a part in the Texas Government Code that addressed unmanned aerial systems, UASs, or drones. And this has since been deemed unconstitutional by a federal judge, but it basically took the tack of let's create a list of all these different types of facilities and assets that we consider critical infrastructure. And then also there's other areas within the Texas Government Code that protect certain types of information from public release, public records release. And it includes verbiage about critical infrastructure information that would provide information about vulnerabilities to critical infrastructure. Well, so this has come into play when people ask for information, and then the Attorney General's office has to rule on this. And I'll read the statement. While the Attorney General has assumed some items to be critical infrastructure, don't bank on it. The requester must give explanation of how the property meets the definition of critical infrastructure. This could be public or private property. So they've ruled on this. And there's been instances where people have asked for information without any type of explanation on why or why not this, and whatever agency had the information may or may not provide guidance on why this is considered critical infrastructure. Well, in certain cases, when no supporting documentation was provided trying to claim that something was critical infrastructure, critical bridges and tunnels, courthouses, city water mains, and Austin Bergstrom International Airport were considered critical infrastructure. In other cases where no support was provided, public school buildings, city water sources, variable air volume laboratory airflow control systems at A&M University, and recreation centers, tennis courts, swimming pools, and such were considered not to be critical infrastructure. So there's from a legal perspective, there is some precedent within, at least with the Texas Attorney General's office, in deeming some things critical infrastructure and some things not. So that's a quick review of some instances of how this appears in policy at the federal and state level. So how do we differentiate critical infrastructure from infrastructure then? How, there's all these different definitions, and that can get rather confusing, but traditionally, how have we determined what is critical infrastructure as opposed to infrastructure? Well, there's a federal program called the National Critical Infrastructure Prioritization Program that was basically created as part of the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which created the Department of Homeland Security. And DHS was charged with creating a prioritized critical infrastructure list that is maintained at the classified, at the secret level. So there's a program, the INCIP, the National Critical Infrastructure Prioritization Program, to identify infrastructure of national significance. And basically something is deemed nationally significant if it meets certain criteria based on is there a reasonable worst case scenario that could cause a catastrophic disruption that would cause these national consequences. And I can't really go into detail on what the measures are that they look at, but generally you're looking at things like loss of life, economic impact, that sort of thing. As far as how bad does it have to be before it's nationally significant and thus considered critical infrastructure based on, for instance, the US Patriot Act definition. Federal government also has a database called the CISA Gateway that houses a lot of infrastructure data. And there's a criticality assessment tool in there that uses a different set of questions for determining what the criticality of infrastructure is. And that was developed by Oregon National Labs. It goes into a little greater detail, I would say, has additional variables that it looks at beyond the National Critical Infrastructure Prioritization Program. And then here in the state of Texas, we have a pilot study we've launched because, yes, we have access to kind of this national list of infrastructure of national significance that's classified at the secret level, but we want to have a better understanding of what is critical at the state level. And for that matter, I'd like to know kind of what would grade out as critical at the regional and local levels as well. So we're developing a process, a program that's based on that Oregon National Labs criticality assessment tool in the CISA Gateway to assess our infrastructure in the state of Texas to varying levels of degree, not just nationally significant or multi-state significant, but state, regional, and local level significance, which, by the way, is in keeping with that definition within the state government code, saying that critical infrastructure is infrastructure that is important to the state or the nation. And then how has this kind of term of critical infrastructure, how has it actually been applied in practice? So in grants, there are federal grant funding programs that they ask for, or they use some of this data, these counts of how much infrastructure of national significance we have to determine grant funding for cities, for states, and such. So this is one area in which that national definition and that INCIP program, that data is used from a funding standpoint. Railroads, they also have some requirements to analyze their routes and determine what are some potential high consequence targets along their transportation routes. And as part of that, the Department of Homeland Security provides them a list of infrastructure along those routes of national significance, which I believe refers to that INCIP list of infrastructure of national significance. So there's an example of how that term critical infrastructure is applied within our own disaster preparedness at the state level. So if I'm called and asked to support the State Operations Center, the SOC, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to my infrastructure data and look at criticality. I'm going to try to identify infrastructure of high criticality that's in the area of impact for the particular disaster, and with the goal of trying to anticipate cascading impacts. So that's an area in which I'm going to use this data, this criticality data, to help inform our disaster response and help us to prioritize resources and efforts and plan for, like I said, the potential for cascading impacts. And then we get back to kind of this basic question that started this whole journey and this whole presentation idea, is this idea of how was this applied during the COVID pandemic. So in the state of Texas, there were 3 executive orders that referenced critical infrastructure. There were 2 talking about quarantine and quarantine of travelers coming from other parts of the nation, and had this verbiage about you have to self-quarantine unless you are connected with military, emergency response, health response, or critical infrastructure functions as determined by the Texas Division of Emergency Management. So this particular government code put the onus on TDEM, the Texas Division of Emergency Management, to determine what qualified. This was a similar one, Order 12, quarantine for other travelers. And then we jump to kind of this other executive order, 14, that was issued not too long after those others, that really focused on continuity of essential services. And this one said that every person in Texas shall, except where necessary to provide or obtain essential services, minimize social gatherings and minimize in-person contact. And this was interesting. So essential services shall consist of everything listed by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and its guidance on the essential critical infrastructure workforce, version 2.0. So this is actually a great document. It's a document provided by DHS CISA that identified all these different positions that they considered essential workforce for critical infrastructure. Interesting thing about that, it provides this, but it doesn't really talk about criticality. It doesn't talk about, does it matter if this person is providing, has this role for a small little operation versus a huge corporation? It doesn't really get into that differentiation. So again, we come to the question of, what do we consider critical infrastructure? Does criticality matter? Or is it just certain types of workers? Is it certain types of companies? And this is kind of a cop-out, but the answer I usually give, I like this quote by Linus Torvalds, who was the creator of the Linux operating system. It basically says, it depends is almost always the right answer to any big question. So it's a question that I continue to tackle on a regular basis within my role as critical infrastructure protection coordinator. And how I respond to the question of what is critical infrastructure really depends on the context. Who is it that's talking to me? What are they trying to accomplish? And I'll just leave you with kind of this last thing is to me personally, I think the most interesting or the most important thing that we need to kind of look at in the realm of critical infrastructure protection is to really start to assess and understand the criticality level of our infrastructure. There's a lot of infrastructure out there, tons of infrastructure in the state of Texas. So from my perspective, I just want to understand how significant is that infrastructure? And then based on what demands we have, what partners we have coming to us asking questions, we'll determine kind of a baseline of, are we interested in just looking at infrastructure of national significance, or are we going to expand that to include multi-state, state, regional, or local significance? But first, we have to take the effort of going in there and assessing our infrastructure to really understand how significant it is and to what level. What's going to happen if that infrastructure is disrupted? What are the consequences? And that's the crux of it, is we really need to have a better understanding of what is the consequences of each piece of infrastructure out there in the state of Texas being disrupted. And I'll end it with that.
Okay, Clint, thank you. That's a lot to digest in a short amount of time. I guess if you can stop, this is a very scary display right here. It's in the red zone, so I don't. So as we synthesize questions that are coming in, I made a bunch of notes here, but again, thank you so much for this. But this, could you elaborate on this assessment tool that's going to go out to the state? Because I think a lot of the folks, this webinar is essentially statewide. And so I imagine that most of the folks are going to want to, from the various industry sectors that we've reached out to, are going to weigh in on exactly this tool that's been developed. And I wasn't able to scribble the whole thing down, but it's a infrastructure assessment tool that's mimicked after the federal level, but focused on Texas. Is that correct?
What it is it's a tool that was developed by Argonne National Labs.
Uh-huh.
And essentially you answer a series of questions that a lot of them deal with issues of what's going to happen if the infrastructure is disrupted. But it also looks at dependencies, and is this infrastructure, do other types of infrastructure depend on this infrastructure for some type of services and such. Right. But what it will do is, after you answer the series of questions and input that information into the assessment tool, it'll tell you whether or not that infrastructure is of national significance, multi-state, state, regional, or local significance. And it'll also give you a scale of 1 to 5 within each of those levels. Okay. So it'll tell you, oh, that's a state level, that's infrastructure of state level significance. And if it's extremely important to the state, it's going to be rated as a 5 within that. So
and
that's
so
kind of,
and then it would be punted to you, or I'm curious.
So what we're doing is we have a pilot study. We're developing a process that we can use on a regular basis to start to collect infrastructure data and conduct these assessments. And I'm working with the councils of government, and I'm working with the Urban Area Security Initiative programs, which are basically our large cities across the state of Texas. And we're working with all these groups. And so currently we're testing this process to make sure that it's going to function well in the state of Texas. But it's going to amount to using kind of reaching out to those regional and local levels to start to identify our infrastructure, and then start to assess the infrastructure using this assessment tool. And we'll gather this infrastructure, we'll gather this data at kind of a state level database, which will provide us with more clarity on what is our most important infrastructure in the state of Texas. Okay. And this will complement kind of what we already have at the national level of this list of infrastructure of national significance.
The reason I'm asking, and we've interacted with a variety of professional organizations that have represented different sectors. And I'm just going to take the Texas Restaurant Association, and they did one of these TEPHI talks, by the way. And Janelle, you can keep me honest on this, but I want to say they produced some interesting statistics on the number of times the average Texan eats out or gets food from a vendor, not from the grocery store, right? And I want to say it was like 3 times a week or something. I don't remember, Janelle. But the point they were trying to make was that when stuff shuts down, people they only have so much food in the stores, so to speak. And then that was echoed by the produce producers there. This same deal that I guess my point is, I'm hoping that as you reach out to get the feedback on these different sectors, that you're targeting professional organizations that represent these collectives. Janelle, would you agree with that?
Sure. I'll even add to that.
Yeah.
How, and I understand the need for secrecy, but how are those workers identified? That I think that was the other part of the question that came up with the International Produce Organization or Association, is how do we identify those critical infrastructure workers so that they may freely travel to work and back home?
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack in what you're saying, because there's a lot of different issues and layers to this. So regarding that question, the best tool we have is still kind of that guidance provided by DHS CISA that identifies the essential workforce. So what we saw in the state of Texas is that's what the governor referred to in determining who was allowed to travel during the pandemic. So I don't believe, me personally, Clint, I don't believe that we have anything that supersedes that as of yet. So currently, that is the best tool. Now we are trying to develop additional sources of data that can be applied. And all this comes down to prioritizing our resources. So if you're looking at individual restaurants, well, if I'm going to evaluate one of these with our criticality assessment tool, it's probably going to it's going to grade out as something of local significance. It's not going to be considered of regional or state level significance based on the questions. So, but it's still potentially significant and can be, depending on the size of the town and how much they rely on a particular restaurant, you could have significance anywhere from that 1 to 5 level within that local area. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to gather and assess and collect, kind of create this database of data that we can provide then to local planners, to the emergency management coordinators at the local level, that they can use to help drive their decision making when it comes to prioritizing resources during a disaster. So it's, again, this whole idea of, it's all a matter of trying to understand our infrastructure, understand the importance and significance of all of our infrastructure, and so that we can better make these informed decisions on prioritizing our resources when we're in these critical kind of disaster times.
And I'm curious, Clint, within that calculation, is there the notion of time sensitivity? And what I mean by that is stuff like animals have to be fed, fresh produce may be going bad. Just taking the ag sector, but in that algorithm that you're describing, is that part factored in there? Do you know, or maybe you don't know?
It doesn't factor in kind of time as far as you need to make sure that something is provided within a given period of time. It doesn't really get to that level, but it does speak to dependencies. And are there other types of companies or whatnot that are dependent on that company? So dependencies, interdependencies. It looks at, is this considered a I didn't even get into this. There's different ways in which you can prioritize infrastructure, lifeline sectors, community lifelines. There's different ways in which you can do that. If you look at community lifelines, it does consider some of these food services and such as being prioritized or priorities. And so that is one of the factors that is part of that criticality assessment tool.
So let's, Rocio, how are we doing on questions coming in?
I have a question.
Yeah.
There is no reference to quantity in the definitions. For example, a failure of one bank is terrible. The failure of many banks in one region is disruptive and significant. Are there no quantities or percentages in the definitions?
Not in the definitions, but that does come into play in the National Critical Infrastructure Prioritization Program. And I kind of touched on that briefly. So this whole idea of, you can look at something as significant that's an individual asset or facility, or you can also examine something as clusters or systems. And that's where you can, if you look at banks, so if you can come up with a disaster that would impact all the banks in a region, you can consider that a cluster. And then you're looking at it from kind of a quantity standpoint. And you can classify that cluster as something of significance. So that is something we look at. We do look at groups of infrastructure, but the infrastructure has to be, related to each other. There's different types of relations that we look at. But again, it has to be infrastructure that can all be disrupted by one type of disaster scenario.
Okay. Rocio, are there other clusters? Speaking of clusters, are there clusters of other questions? Because I have a few more.
You can go ahead, Bob.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious. I was very intrigued by this DHS taxonomy, and I was not familiar with this coding system for IDT.
Yeah, infrastructure data taxonomy. Yeah.
Infrastructure
data taxonomy is what it's. That's what IDT stands for.
Okay, and then they assign it a code, a code number.
Yeah, there are code numbers that they assign it to, and those are referenced oftentimes within the National Critical Infrastructure Prioritization Program. But they also list what is the corresponding NAICS code.
That's exactly where, dude. I was.
Yeah.
I was getting ready to ask that question.
If you look at the spreadsheet, it lists the NAICS codes and how they correspond, so you can look at that and kind of crosswalk it.
Okay, so the ink won't flake off your diploma then. I was getting ready to ask that question.
Come at me.
No, that's good. I was very interested in this. So, Janelle, any questions there? I'm gonna circle.
I have another one. I have another one.
Rocio, okay, yeah.
Are you starting your data collection with existing data sets, or are you having the stakeholders start listing their CI from scratch?
Sure. So what we're doing is right now we're in the pilot study process. So we're trying to develop this process and make sure that it's a viable process. And so what we're doing is we're asking them to identify basically what do they consider their most important infrastructure. And we're assessing that infrastructure, but we are referencing existing data sets. So I didn't even talk about that. I mean, we have tons of infrastructure data. We have our GIS capabilities have tons of data that we can access. So we have a lot of data already regarding the infrastructure in the state of Texas. A lot of that comes from DHS has the Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data. Let's see, Highfeld, Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data set. So that's a data set that you can obtain from DHS that's pretty much going to give you all the infrastructure that meets various categories within the 16 critical infrastructure sectors for GIS mapping purposes. So, I mean, we have tons of infrastructure data, but yeah, this process is kind of taking some of that information and starting to narrow it down and assess the criticality. So we can reference some of that data when we need the information, but we're kind of starting from scratch and letting the jurisdictions themselves determine what infrastructure they want to focus on initially.
And I'm wondering, I'll turn this over to Janelle here just a second to bring in for a landing, but TEPHI would certainly be well positioned to help advertise this effort once you guys refine it, to get it out across the state, to encourage feedback from all Texans on what their concerns are, whether it's an organization or just individuals. I think that would be very helpful.
Oh, and I appreciate that. And really the challenge at our level is when you look at infrastructure, there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Each sector has multiple subsectors. And then within each subsector, you have all types of different assets, facilities, and such. So let's take one asset type, water treatment facilities, within one subsector of one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Well, there's almost 10,000 water treatment facilities in the state of Texas. So if you look at that, there's hundreds of thousands of infrastructure assets out there and facilities that we need to assess. And that's always the challenge, is having the resources to be able to assess a ton of this infrastructure when it is somewhat time intensive to work through and research the infrastructure and complete one of these criticality assessments. So that's always a challenge we have, but it's something that, like I said, we're working on creating a process so that we can start to work through that challenge.
Right. I mean, when we're the size of, when the state of Texas is the size of an economic impact of many countries, that's
yeah. I mean, we have the 9th largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
So it's incredible. It's incredible.
Right. Well, Clint, thank you so much. I'm going to kick it over to Janelle. You're going to do some closing remarks here and bring this in for a landing.
I am, and I want to say thank you, Clint. Clearly, you have your job, a very important job to do, and it's a lot of work. And I was going to ask a question about how can public health support you in your efforts, and vice versa. But we don't have time for that question, as well as a couple of others that I saw both in the Q&A and in the chat box. But tell you what, everybody, what we're going to do is send those questions to Clint and maybe try to get responses to those questions at a later date. But I do need to bring this to a close because we really have just 1 minute left. I want to thank Clint on behalf of the Texas Epidemic Public Health Institute and all the work you're doing out there to keep us safe. And everybody in the audience, thank you very much for joining us. And you will receive an evaluation survey as soon as you depart the webinar. Please fill it out because it does help us with future programming. In addition, we would love to see you guys in our trainings in the future, other future webcasts. In fact, let me put a pitch for Grand Rounds, which is at 4 p.m. this afternoon. I think we're talking about Chagas disease at 4 o'clock this afternoon. So this is the way to reach us. Here's a handy QR code to join our efforts. And again, I thank everybody for joining this webcast today. Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Dr. Emery, and thank you to the TEPHI staff for supporting this effort today. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.